Once mocked as the fat girl nobody would ever take, she is now the Mafia boss's most fierce obsession. How could someone once dismissed so completely become the center of such intense attention? What changed? And what does that transformation truly reveal? Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy heartfelt cinematic stories filled with emotion, resilience, and unforgettable characters, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thank you for being here and for supporting this growing community with your time and encouragement. Before we begin, let me ask you this. Do you believe the people others overlook can one day become the ones no one can forget? Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and let the story unfold from the very beginning. The world always notices the loudest voices, but it rarely remembers the quietest hearts. I used to believe people saw me before I even opened my mouth. Not my smile, not my kindness, not the dreams I carried home every night after another 10-hour shift. They saw my body first, and somehow that became the entire story. My name is Chloe Bennett, although for years it felt like nobody cared enough to remember it. Around town, at school, even at family gatherings, I was simply the fat girl. It was a label that followed me, like a shadow stretching across every room I entered. I learned to laugh before anyone else could. I learned to make jokes about myself before someone else did. I learned that if I smiled first, maybe their words would hurt a little less. They never did. Tonight was supposed to be nothing more than another class reunion at an elegant downtown hotel overlooking the city skyline. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead. Soft jazz floated through the ballroom, and expensive perfume mixed with the scent of fresh roses arranged on every table. Everyone looked polished, successful, and perfectly confident. Everyone except me, or at least that's what I convinced myself. I paused outside the entrance, smoothing the sleeves of my navy blue dress. It wasn't designer, it wasn't trendy, but it was clean, comfortable, and the first outfit I'd worn in years that made me feel even slightly beautiful. My reflection in the glass doors stared back at me with nervous eyes. For a moment, I almost turned around. Then I remembered something my grandmother used to whisper whenever life felt too heavy. Never let someone else's opinion become your mirror. I repeated those words under my breath before stepping inside. The conversations didn't stop when I entered, but the glances arrived exactly as I expected. Some people smiled politely. Others pretended not to notice me at all. A few exchanged quick looks that needed no explanation. Across the room, someone laughed, and although I couldn't hear the words, I recognized the expression. I'd seen it for most of my life. I greeted old classmates with genuine warmth, asking about their families, their careers, and their children. Most answered kindly enough. A few struggled to remember my name. One didn't even try. "Hey," she said with an awkward grin. "I almost didn't recognize you." I smiled anyway. "It's been a long time." Then another familiar voice floated through the crowd, carrying just enough volume for nearby guests to hear. Well, the fat girl actually showed up. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter followed. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Strange, I thought. Maybe pain loses its sharp edges after enough years. Maybe disappointment simply becomes another sound in the background. I reached for a glass of sparkling water and looked toward the tall windows overlooking the glowing city lights. Outside, sleek black luxury vehicles began pulling up to the front entrance, one after another. Conversations softened, heads turned. No one inside seemed to know why they had arrived. Neither did I. But somehow, without understanding the reason, I felt the evening quietly shifting beneath my feet. The ballroom grew quieter with every passing second, although no one had officially announced anything. It was the kind of silence that arrived before an important guest entered, carried by curiosity instead of words. I watched through the towering glass windows as another polished black sedan stopped beneath the hotel entrance canopy. Then another. Men in tailored charcoal suits stepped out first, speaking calmly into discreet earpieces before opening the rear door of the final car. Every conversation around me shifted toward the entrance. The woman who had laughed at me only moments earlier suddenly straightened her posture and checked her reflection in the back of a silver serving tray. Someone whispered that an influential businessman might be arriving. Someone else guessed it was a famous investor. I simply wrapped both hands around my glass of sparkling water and wished everyone would stop staring toward the doors. The attention in the room felt strangely contagious, pulling every pair of eyes in the same direction. Soft piano music continued drifting through hidden speakers, but nobody seemed to hear it anymore. Then the hotel doors opened. A tall man walked inside with an effortless confidence that did not ask for attention because it already owned it. His dark, tailored suit fit perfectly. His expression remained calm, and his steady pace never changed despite every head turning toward him. He did not smile. He did not wave. He simply looked around the room with quiet focus, as though searching for someone rather than enjoying the admiration surrounding him. I lowered my eyes almost immediately. Whoever he was, he belonged to a world far removed from mine. I had spent enough years comparing myself with strangers to know there was nothing waiting for me in another glance. Instead, I reached toward the refreshment table, hoping a small dessert might calm the nervous knot in my stomach. Before my fingers touched the plate, another guest stepped in front of me without noticing. The tiny plate slipped from my hand and landed on the white tablecloth with a soft clatter. A few chocolate-covered strawberries rolled across the polished surface. Heat rushed into my cheeks. It was not a disaster. It was barely an accident. Yet years of embarrassment had trained my heart to expect laughter before kindness. I quietly apologized and bent down to pick up the fallen plate. Another hand reached it first. Long fingers lifted it effortlessly before offering it back to me. I looked up. The same man from the entrance stood only a few feet away, up close. His eyes were unexpectedly gentle, carrying the calm confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. He handed me the plate as though it were the most ordinary moment in the world. Then, in a voice so natural it almost disappeared beneath the music, he asked, "Have you eaten?" For a heartbeat, I wondered whether he was speaking to someone behind me. I glanced over my shoulder. There was no one else. "I am sorry," I answered quietly. His expression softened just enough to reveal the smallest hint of warmth. "You looked like you forgot to take care of yourself." Nobody had ever started a conversation with me like that. Not by asking what size I wore. Not by pretending I should feel lucky to receive attention. Not by offering empty compliments. Just one simple question that somehow felt more sincere than anything I had heard all evening. Around us, whispers began moving through the ballroom like a cool breeze. I could feel dozens of curious eyes settling on us, but he seemed completely unaware of them. Or perhaps he simply did not care. I had no idea why a stranger had chosen to stop beside me when the room was filled with people who appeared far more impressive. All I knew was that, for the first time in years, someone had looked directly at me without making me feel invisible. I stood there for several seconds after he walked away, still holding the empty dessert plate as though it contained an answer I had somehow missed. The conversation had lasted less than a minute, yet it left the room feeling strangely different. People were still watching, not with kindness, not with admiration, mostly with confusion. A woman I vaguely remembered from high school leaned toward her friend and whispered something behind her hand before both of them glanced in my direction. I could not hear the words, but I recognized the look. They were trying to solve a puzzle. Why had a man like him spoken to someone like me? I wished I knew the answer myself. Before I could gather my thoughts, one of the hotel staff approached me with a polite smile. "Miss Bennett," she said softly, "the gentleman asked us to bring you a fresh dessert. He noticed yours was dropped." She placed a small white plate in front of me. Fresh strawberries, a slice of cheesecake, and a warm cup of tea rested neatly on the tray. "There must be some mistake," I replied. "I did not order this." The young woman smiled again. He insisted. She left before I could ask another question. I looked around the ballroom, searching for the stranger, but he was already surrounded by several people near the far end of the room. Men in tailored suits greeted him with quiet respect. The hotel manager himself appeared beside him, speaking with careful attention, whoever he was. He clearly carried influence without ever raising his voice, yet something felt unusual. Every few minutes, while others competed for his attention, his eyes drifted across the room. Not for long, just a brief glance before returning to the conversation in front of him. The first time, I convinced myself I imagined it. The second time, I looked away before our eyes could meet. By the third, I found myself wondering why. I was not the most successful woman there. I was certainly not the most glamorous. There was nothing about me that belonged in his world. I quietly thanked the server and took a small bite of cheesecake. It was surprisingly good, smooth and rich, with just enough sweetness to soften the bitterness lingering from earlier comments. My grandmother used to tell me that kindness often arrived in ordinary moments, disguised as something too small to notice. Perhaps this was one of those moments. Across the ballroom, laughter rose again as old classmates exchanged stories about promotions, vacations, and expensive homes. I listened politely whenever someone included me in the conversation, but my attention kept drifting toward the windows overlooking the city. The lights below shimmered like scattered stars across the streets, reminding me how enormous the world really was. Maybe tonight was simply another reminder that life could still surprise me. As the evening continued, I decided not to spend another minute wondering about a stranger. I had survived far more difficult days than an unexpected conversation. I picked up my purse, intending to leave before the reunion became even more uncomfortable. Just as I reached the hotel entrance, the valet opened the front doors. Cool evening air brushed against my face. Parked beneath the glowing entrance lights was the same line of elegant black cars. One of the drivers stepped forward, opened a rear passenger door, and then paused without speaking. I looked behind me, assuming he was waiting for someone else. Instead, the stranger emerged from the lobby with the same calm expression, stopping only a few feet away. He looked at me as though our conversation had never truly ended, and with quiet sincerity he asked, "Would you allow me to walk you to your car?" For a second, I simply stared at him, convinced he had mistaken me for someone else. The hotel entrance reflected golden light across the polished marble floor, while a cool evening breeze carried the distant sound of traffic through the open doors. Guests continued leaving the reunion behind us, and I could feel more than a few curious glances settling on the unexpected conversation unfolding only a few feet away. I offered an awkward smile. "That is very kind of you. But my car is just across the parking lot." He nodded as though he had expected the answer. "Then allow me to walk beside you." There was no pressure in his voice, no attempt to impress me, no assumption that I would say yes simply because he had asked. That alone caught me off guard. I hesitated before finally giving a small nod. "All right." We stepped into the cool night together. The city skyline shimmered above us, windows glowing against the dark sky like thousands of tiny lanterns. The reunion ballroom slowly disappeared behind us, replaced by the quieter sounds of footsteps crossing the wide parking area. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Surprisingly, the silence never felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. "I never thanked you," I finally said, "for the dessert." He glanced at me with a faint smile. "You looked like you deserved one." I laughed softly before I could stop myself. Most people would not describe cheesecake as something someone deserves. "Perhaps they should," he answered. Small kindnesses are often remembered longer than expensive gifts. His words stayed with me. They sounded less like a clever remark, and more like something he genuinely believed. We reached my aging blue sedan parked beneath a street lamp. Compared to the luxury vehicles waiting near the hotel entrance, my little car looked almost invisible. I instinctively apologized. "It is not much." He looked at the car for only a brief second before meeting my eyes again. "It brought you here. That is enough." I could not remember the last time someone had answered without judgment. Before I could thank him again, a familiar voice interrupted from several spaces away. "Chloe." I turned and saw Melissa, one of my former classmates, standing beside her husband. She looked from me to the well-dressed stranger and then back again. Her smile appeared friendly, but curiosity flickered behind it. "Everything all right?" "Everything is fine," I answered. "We were just saying good night." Melissa's eyes lingered on him for another moment. "I do not think we have met." Before I could respond, he extended his hand politely. "Adrian." Nothing more. No title. No explanation. Melissa introduced herself, but he simply nodded with the same quiet courtesy he had shown me. After a few brief words, she and her husband walked away, though I noticed her glance over her shoulder twice before reaching their car. The moment they disappeared, I looked back at Adrian. "You never told me why you came over to me inside." His expression grew thoughtful. "Because everyone else seemed more interested in being noticed than in noticing others." I blinked, unsure how to answer. He continued walking toward the waiting line of black cars, but stopped after only a few steps. "Drive home safely, Chloe." Hearing my name spoken so naturally felt strangely unfamiliar. He had remembered it after hearing it only once. I watched as one of the suited men opened the rear door for him. Before getting inside, Adrian looked back one final time, offering a calm nod instead of a dramatic farewell. Then the door closed. The convoy quietly pulled away from the hotel, and the night became still again. As I unlocked my car and settled into the driver's seat, I realized something that made even less sense than our conversation. Out of everyone who had attended the reunion, he was the only person who had asked how I was doing without expecting anything in return. I had no idea whether I would ever see Adrian again. Somehow, deep inside, I already suspected our paths had not crossed for the last time. The next morning, I convinced myself that the evening belonged in the past. By 8 o'clock, I was already arranging fresh flowers near the entrance of the neighborhood bookstore where I had worked for nearly 6 years. It was a small, family-owned shop tucked between a coffee house and a tailor's store, the kind of place where regular customers knew one another by name. The scent of paper, coffee, and polished wood always settled my restless thoughts. Books never judged anyone by appearance. They only asked to be opened. I preferred their company more often than I admitted. Mrs. Harper, the owner, smiled as she unlocked the front door. "You look different today, Chloe." I looked down at my sweater, wondering if I had spilled something during breakfast. "Different how?" She laughed softly. "Lighter. Like you finally slept well." I smiled without answering, because I was not entirely sure she was right. I had slept, but my dreams had been strangely peaceful, interrupted only by brief memories of calm grey eyes, and one simple question that continued echoing through my thoughts. "Have you eaten?" It was such an ordinary sentence, yet nobody had ever asked it with that much sincerity before. By late morning, customers filled the store. An elderly man searched for history books, while 2 young sisters sat cross-legged in the children's section, laughing over a picture book about talking bears. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. Around noon, the bell above the front door chimed again. Without looking up, I greeted the customer automatically. "Welcome. Let me know if I can help you find anything." Silence answered first. Then a familiar voice. I was hoping you could. My heart skipped before I slowly looked up from the stack of novels in my hands. Adrian stood just inside the doorway, dressed far more casually than the night before. Instead of a tailored suit, he wore a dark navy jacket over a simple white shirt. He somehow looked even more approachable, although the quiet confidence surrounding him remained exactly the same. For a brief second, I wondered whether I was imagining him. You found me, I said before realizing how strange that sounded. His smile was almost invisible. I remembered where you said you worked. I frowned slightly. I do not remember telling you. You mentioned the bookstore during one of your conversations at the reunion, he replied. You were speaking with an old classmate while waiting near the dessert table. I blinked in surprise. I had completely forgotten that conversation. Somehow, he had not. So, I asked, folding my arms with playful curiosity, what kind of book brings you here? Adrian glanced around the shelves before answering. I am looking for a novel that reminds people it is never too late to become the person they were always meant to be. His answer sounded less like a shopping request and more like a quiet confession. I walked toward the fiction section, inviting him to follow. That is a very specific description. I hoped you might know exactly where to find it. We stopped in front of a display of best-selling novels. I carefully selected one with a weathered blue cover and handed it to him. This one helped me through a difficult year, I admitted, whenever I felt like giving up. I read another chapter. He accepted the book with genuine interest, rather than polite obligation. Then I trust your recommendation. Before I could respond, the bookstore door opened again. Melissa stepped inside, carrying a shopping bag. The moment she noticed Adrian standing beside me, surprise spread across her face. She hesitated long enough for the expression to become impossible to hide. Chloe, she said slowly, I did not expect to see you two together again. Adrian remained perfectly calm, but I sensed the atmosphere around us changing in ways I could not yet explain. Melissa closed the bookstore door behind her, but instead of browsing the shelves as she usually did, she remained standing near the entrance with an expression balanced somewhere between surprise and disbelief. Her eyes moved from Adrian to me and back again, as though she expected one of us to explain a situation that made no sense. I cleared my throat first. Melissa, are you looking for something specific today? She blinked, before forcing a polite smile. Actually, I came to pick up the mystery novel I ordered last week. Mrs. Harper cheerfully called from behind the register that it would be ready in just a moment. The familiar warmth of the bookstore slowly returned, but the unusual silence between the three of us remained. Melissa looked toward Adrian again. You seem to know Chloe pretty well. Before I could answer, Adrian spoke with the same calm voice that never seemed rushed. We have only met recently. There was nothing secretive about his reply, yet it somehow discouraged further questions. Melissa nodded, although curiosity still lingered across her face. Well, it is a small world. Adrian smiled politely, but did not add anything more. Moments later, Mrs. Harper returned with Melissa's order, and after a brief goodbye, she left the store, though I noticed her glance back through the front window before disappearing down the sidewalk. As the bell above the door rang one final time, I let out a quiet breath I had not realized I was holding. She is going to tell everyone she knows that you were here, I admitted with an embarrassed laugh. Adrian looked genuinely puzzled. Would that be a problem? People enjoy creating stories when they do not know the truth. He considered my answer for a second before replying, Perhaps the truth is usually less interesting than what people imagine. I laughed again, this time more naturally. You always answer questions like that. Only when I do not know the perfect answer. His honesty caught me off guard. Most successful people I had met always seemed determined to appear certain about everything. Adrian appeared comfortable admitting uncertainty, and somehow that made him seem even more confident. During the next half hour, he wandered slowly through the bookstore, asking thoughtful questions about different authors and occasionally stopping to read the opening pages of a novel. He never checked his phone. He never appeared impatient. It was difficult to imagine someone with his quiet authority spending an afternoon discussing books with a bookstore employee he barely knew. Eventually, he approached the register holding the novel I had recommended. As Mrs. Harper prepared the receipt, she smiled warmly. "Any friend of Chloe's is always welcome here." I felt my cheeks grow warm. Before I could correct the assumption, Adrian answered gently, "Then I hope to visit again." After paying for the book, he turned toward me. "Thank you for your recommendation." "You are welcome," I replied. "I hope you enjoy it." He paused near the doorway before asking one final question. "Do you always work on Thursdays?" I hesitated for only a moment. "Usually, yes." He nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps I will see you again." There was no promise hidden in his words and no expectation that I owed him anything. It sounded simply like someone who enjoyed the possibility of another conversation. After he stepped outside, I watched through the window as he walked away alone, carrying nothing except the single novel tucked beneath his arm. There were no black luxury cars waiting this time, no crowd surrounding him. Just one man disappearing into the afternoon sunlight. Mrs. Harper leaned against the counter with an amused smile. "He seems like a gentleman." I looked toward the empty sidewalk where he had vanished only seconds before. "I think," I answered quietly, "he might be the first person who ever made me feel completely seen without asking me to become someone else." Over the next 2 weeks, life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and unexpectedly different. Every Thursday afternoon, sometime between 2 and 3 o'clock, the bell above the bookstore door chimed, and Adrian stepped inside carrying the same quiet composure that had first caught my attention. He never arrived with an audience. He never demanded special treatment. Most days he left with a single book tucked beneath his arm and a thoughtful conversation that lingered in my mind long after he was gone. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. Then I began setting aside novels I thought he might enjoy. Historical biographies, classic American literature, memoirs about ordinary people who had found extraordinary courage. Somehow he always seemed genuinely interested in my recommendations, asking questions that made me think more deeply about stories I believed I already understood. "Why do you like this author?" he asked one afternoon, holding a weathered paperback in his hands. I smiled as I adjusted a display near the register. "Because the characters are never rescued by magic. They change because they choose to." Adrian studied the cover for a moment before nodding. "The strongest people usually do." There was something in the way he said those words that suggested he was speaking from experience rather than imagination. I wanted to ask more, but I sensed he guarded certain parts of his life carefully. Oddly enough, I respected that. We talked about books, music, favorite childhood memories, and the places we hoped to visit someday. Yet neither of us asked the questions that seemed most obvious. I never asked what he truly did for a living. He never asked why I still doubted compliments that sounded sincere. Somehow, those silences felt as meaningful as the conversations themselves. Mrs. Harper noticed the pattern long before I admitted it to myself. One Thursday, after Adrian had left, she leaned against a shelf with an amused smile. "He always waits until the store is quiet before he comes in." I looked up from the stack of novels I was organizing. "Maybe he just likes peaceful places," she chuckled softly. "Or maybe he enjoys talking to a certain bookseller without interrupting her work." I laughed, shaking my head. "You are reading too many romance novels." "Maybe," she replied. "Or maybe I have lived long enough to recognize kindness when I see it." Her words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Kindness. That was exactly what made Adrian different. He never tried to impress me with expensive watches or polished speeches. He listened. He remembered small details. Once, after I casually mentioned loving cinnamon tea during the winter, he returned the following week with a beautifully wrapped box from a local tea shop. There was no extravagant ribbon or dramatic presentation, just a handwritten note tucked inside that read, "For your next good book." I almost cried when I opened it, not because of the gift itself, but because someone had remembered something so small. One rainy Thursday, dark clouds covered the afternoon sky, and heavy drops tapped gently against the bookstore windows. Business was slow. Adrian stood near the front display reading the opening chapter of a novel, while I sorted newly arrived shipments behind the counter. The peaceful silence was suddenly interrupted when the front door swung open much harder than usual. A man in an expensive suit stepped inside, his expression tense as he searched the room. The moment he spotted Adrian, relief crossed his face. He approached quickly but stopped a respectful distance away. "Sir," he said quietly, "I have been trying to reach you all afternoon." Adrian looked up from the book without the slightest hint of irritation. "I turned my phone off. Everyone is waiting for you." The man lowered his voice even further, but in the quiet bookstore, I still caught the next sentence. "The board refuses to begin until you arrive." I froze where I stood, watching Adrian close the novel with calm, unhurried hands. For the first time since we had met, I realized the quiet man who loved bookstores might be carrying responsibilities far greater than I had ever imagined. The room remained completely still after the visitor spoke. Rain continued tracing soft patterns across the bookstore windows, while the scent of fresh paper and brewed coffee filled the quiet air. Adrian slipped the novel beneath his arm and looked at the man with the same calm expression I had come to recognize over the past few weeks. "Please let them know. I will arrive shortly," he said. The man nodded immediately. "Of course, sir." Before leaving, he glanced toward me with polite curiosity, then quietly disappeared back into the rain. The front door closed, and the little bell above it echoed through the shop before silence returned once more. I pretended to straighten a stack of hardcover books, hoping Adrian would not notice how many questions were suddenly racing through my mind. He walked toward the counter with an apologetic smile. "I am sorry about the interruption. It sounded important," I replied carefully. He looked down at the novel resting in his hands. "Some responsibilities cannot wait forever." His answer revealed almost nothing, yet somehow it felt completely honest. I studied him for a moment before asking the question that had been growing inside me since the reunion. "What exactly do you do?" He was quiet for several seconds. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the distant skyline. Finally, he answered, "I oversee several companies that employ many people. Decisions I make affect families, not only businesses. That is why I try not to make them carelessly." It was a simple explanation, but it carried the weight of someone who understood responsibility far beyond financial success. I nodded, slowly. "That sounds like a difficult life." "Sometimes," he admitted. "It also reminds me that titles are temporary. Character stays much longer." His words settled gently between us. They reminded me of the conversations we often shared about books, where the greatest heroes were rarely the richest people in the story. Mrs. Harper approached with 2 warm cups of cinnamon tea and placed them on the counter with a knowing smile. "You both look like you could use a break." Adrian thanked her before taking a careful sip. "This is excellent." Mrs. Harper laughed. "Chloe recommended the blend months ago. It has become our most popular tea." He looked at me with quiet amusement. "You have good instincts." I shrugged. "People usually know what brings them comfort." "Including you?" he asked. I looked down at the rising steam curling above my cup. I am still learning. For the first time since we had met, neither of us reached for another question. We simply stood together listening to the rain. It felt remarkable that silence could become its own conversation. Eventually, Adrian glanced toward the clock on the wall and sighed almost reluctantly. "I really do have to leave," I smiled. "Your board meeting should probably start before sunset." A faint laugh escaped him. "They would agree with you." As he reached for the door, he paused and turned back. "Next Thursday, if you are working, I would like to hear your thoughts on the novel." "Only if you promise to tell me whether you liked the ending," I replied. "That is a fair trade." He stepped outside into the steady rain without opening an umbrella. Seconds later, a sleek black sedan rolled quietly to the curb, as though it had been waiting at exactly the right moment. The driver stepped out and respectfully opened the rear door. Adrian acknowledged him with a simple nod before getting inside. The car disappeared into the grey afternoon, leaving only ripples across the wet street. Mrs. Harper joined me by the window, folding her arms as we watched the rain. "That young man carries a great deal on his shoulders," she said softly. I nodded. "Yes." Then I looked down at the novel he had purchased the week before, still resting on the empty display where he had first picked it up. For the first time, I realized I was no longer wondering who Adrian was. I was beginning to wonder what kind of person he became when no one else was watching. The following Thursday arrived wrapped in clear blue skies, and sunlight poured through the bookstore windows, painting warm rectangles across the wooden floor. I found myself glancing at the clock far more often than I cared to admit. Each time the little bell above the entrance chimed, my heart lifted for a brief second before settling again. Customers came and went. A retired teacher searched for gardening books. A young couple debated which cookbook to buy for their first apartment. Life continued exactly as it always had, yet something inside me had quietly changed. I was no longer waiting for someone to rescue me. I was simply hoping to continue a conversation that made me feel understood. Just after 2 o'clock, the familiar bell rang again. Adrian stepped inside, carrying the novel I had recommended weeks earlier. Several colorful bookmarks peeked from between its pages. He smiled the moment our eyes met. "I finished it," he said. "And?" I asked. Unable to hide my curiosity, he gently placed the book on the counter between us. "You were right. The ending was not about becoming someone new. It was about finally believing the person you already were had always been enough." His words lingered in the quiet bookstore. I looked down at the worn cover and smiled. That was my favorite part, too. Adrian rested one hand lightly against the counter. "It reminded me of someone." I laughed softly. "Which character?" He looked directly into my eyes before answering. "The one who spent years believing the world had already decided her worth." I felt my breath catch. Nobody had ever described me with such honesty and such kindness at the same time. Before I could find the right response, the bookstore door opened again. Melissa stepped inside with 2 other classmates from the reunion. Their cheerful conversation faded the moment they noticed Adrian standing beside me. One of them whispered something under her breath. Melissa looked almost embarrassed by the silence that followed. Then, with surprising sincerity, she walked toward me. "Chloe," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology." I blinked in surprise. "For what?" She lowered her eyes. "For the way people treated you over the years." I laughed when I should have spoken up. I told myself it was harmless, but it was not. "I am sorry." The words were simple. They were not dramatic. Somehow, they carried more weight than I expected. I smiled gently. "Thank you." She looked relieved, as though she had been carrying those words for a very long time. After she and her friends wandered toward another section of the store, Adrian looked at me. "You forgave her very quickly." I thought about the frightened young woman I used to be, the one who measured her value by other people's opinions. Then I shook my head with a peaceful smile. Holding on to old pain never made me lighter. Adrian nodded slowly, almost as if he had learned something important. We walked together toward the front window, watching families pass beneath the bright afternoon sun. Children laughed as they chased one another along the sidewalk. An elderly couple held hands while carrying shopping bags. Ordinary moments, ordinary people. They suddenly felt extraordinary. "Do you know what I have realized?" I asked. Adrian turned toward me. "What is that?" I smiled, not because my life had become perfect, but because I finally understood something I had spent years searching for. The right people never ask you to become smaller so they can feel bigger. They simply make room for you exactly as you are. Adrian's quiet smile answered before his words did. "Then I hope I always make room." In that moment, surrounded by shelves filled with stories about courage, hope, and second chances, I realized the greatest change had not happened in the people around me. It had happened inside my own heart. The world had not suddenly become kinder overnight. I had simply stopped allowing its harshest voices to define my reflection. And somehow, that was the beginning of the happiest chapter I had ever lived.